All right.
Is that phone not in this one? Is that phone not in this one?
Does not sound like it is. What? Okay. Hi. Welcome to day of debating traditionally. I believe this crowd is smaller than the last one, so apparently some people didn't realize it was a track with multiple days. Today we're going to talk about affirming and the ways to affirm while debating traditionally. So if you recall from yesterday, the sort of opening quote was about incorporating multiple independent reasons on the flow into an overarching thesis that advocates a clear, concise advocacy that gets to the truth of the resolution using logical and emotional appeals, that long sentence. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the context of affirming, and then go through casing, the 1AR, the 2AR, when debating traditionally. There will be some examples of lay affirmative that are read, and then we'll walk through the parts of that affirmative that are strategic and the parts that are not strategic. So let's first of all just talk about why affirming sucks. So why does affirming suck? The 1AR is just the worst. The 1AR is awful. It's just so hard to be AF and give a 1AR, especially given that you can't do things that you might do in circuit debate to make your 1AR easier. So you can't, for example, spread, or you can't get, for example, more efficient at certain phrases that you can just use jargon to get your way out of. You can't use tricks like strategies to get your way out. You can't uplayer. You can't do anything like that. You're stuck with just straight up answering 7 minutes of speech in 4 minutes, which is difficult. And there's one other thing that makes being affirmative hard, especially in traditional debates. So how often is the resolution a more liberal policy on the political spectrum? And I'd say most of the time it is, right? And given that most of your judges are not necessarily inclined to believe in liberal things, and more importantly, inclined towards believing the status quo, the affirmative suffers from status quo bias, which is that people are generally pretty comfortable with how the status quo is, which means intuitively they're pretty not inclined to change it. So those are the two big things that you have to recognize and overcome when you're affirming, are the 1AR and the fact that the presumption will always lie against you. If the debate comes out even in a traditional debate, judges are almost always going to prefer to stick with the status quo. So I actually think that affirming is not that hard, though, and I think that there are three particular reasons why. So I think the first reason for why affirming is pretty easy, actually, is because you get to set the entire stage for the debate. Recognizing that you have a 1AC that lays the groundwork for how the rest of the debate is going to develop is not something that should be underestimated. A lot of people write cases for the sole purposes of writing cases. That's not how it should work. The case should do two things. The first is it should set up the 2AR. It should make the 2AR basically, it should be the building blocks for it. When you give a winning 2AR, when you imagine in your head, I'm going to win this debate with this 2AR is going to be round winning, it has to have a foundation from which it can build its offensive attack from. And that only happens if you have a 1AC that is solid in the first place. And the second reason for why you really need to care about casing is because it sets the ground for how the entire rest of the debate is going to play out. What arguments that you choose to read, however you choose to frame the resolution, massively determines how the negative is going to engage. And the more that you are prepared and write a good affirmative case, the better you are going to be, and the easier the 1AR is going to be. Affirmatives who just write their cases for the sole sake of writing their cases, or just throw together a couple of random contention cards, like a lot of people do in lay debate, or just make their life too easy by just trying to read whatever is easiest and takes the least work to cut, are doing themselves a disservice, given that it actually isn't just about the case, it is entirely about the 1AR and the 2AR. The second reason for why affirming is good is because you get the 2AR, and in traditional debate, this advantage cannot be underestimated. Debates generally are decided after the 1AR, in the sense that if you give a bad 1AR, you auto-lose. But as long as you don't give a terrible 1AR, the 2AR is almost always a round winner. As long as you are surviving into the 2AR, as long as you aren't immediately, haven't immediately lost the debate because your 1AR was terrible, you generally can win because the 2AR's last persuasive word gets to make new weighing arguments. It gets to change the judge's mind. It gets to make the debate very easy for the judge to understand. It's the one speech that gets to actually sum up every argument in the round and boil it down to its essence and really write a true ballot story. Negatives can only attempt to write a ballot story because they don't know what your 2AR is going to be like. They're going to try their best to clean up the round. They're most likely not going to be able to do so. The 2AR gets to do that, and that's not something that's to be underestimated. And finally, you want to be AF because it generally just has the better literature. Most of the topics just suck for the neg in terms of what literature you're going to be able to get. Maybe not on this topic that we're debating at camp, but the last camp topic was about the universal basic income. And in terms of relative quality skew of the literature, the affirmative was just clearly better in terms of the general reason for why UBI is good. Now, the negative had an advantage. They could read whatever counterclaim that they wanted on a topic, and the counterclaim literature was good. But in terms of just a general traditional UBI good versus bad debate, the AF had better literature. On the nationals topic about civil liberties versus national security, the AF just had better literature. On the March-April topic about the right to housing, the AF definitively had better literature. There was no argument for why there wasn't a right to housing. The topic was awful. On the free speech topic, the AF literature was just so much better than most of the negative literature, right? So you need to take advantage of all of these things and recognize that these are advantages that you have. So we're going to start now by talking about casing and how to write a case in lay debate. So I think a lot of people approach cases sort of top down, which is where they think of the most persuasive idea they can imagine in their head because they follow the shortcuts of asking their parents for advice on how the topic should work, and they just are like, this seems like the easiest way to fit something within my framework. And I guess to some degree it makes sense. But I really think to truly be good at traditional debate, you need to bottom-up case. And bottom-up case means that you need to start with reading background literature. You need to move, and from the background literature, you need to move into more and more specific narrow parts of the research, as opposed to starting with an idea and going through the research. What bottom-up research allows you to do is it allows the evidence to guide your position instead of the other way around, where your position dictates what evidence you choose. Making the position and forcing evidence into that narrow spot means you're generally going to settle for subpar quality evidence. In a debate where you can only read maybe 4 or 5 cards total in the affirmative constructive and virtually none in the 1AR, every card that you choose needs to be the highest quality card you can imagine. The negative can get away with choosing some low quality cards. They have a 7-minute speech, they're going to be able to read a lot more cards than you. But generally most affirmative cases contain no more than 10 cards, and most 1ARs in traditional debates contain no more than 1 card. This is a very small amount of evidence, and you need to be sure that every card that you're reading is the best quality that you can have. So you want to start bottom up. That allows you to find the best evidence, the evidence that dictates the position. But not only does that allow you to have higher quality evidence, I think it matters from the intuitive side of things. The reason that people do top-down casing is because they think of an intuitive idea and are like, let's see if I can find some evidence to support this intuitive idea. But clearly, you're a debater. You have prejudices. You have biases. You think this argument is intuitive to you. But it's clearly not intuitive to everyone else if there's no argument in the literature to support it, right? The only way to ensure that that argument is intuitive and accessible to a wide variety of judges, including parent judges and circuit judges and judges in between, is to make sure that your evidence is the highest quality stuff on the topic. And that only happens from bottom up, right? And that means that you're only going to get the most intuitive arguments on the topic. And so when you build your case from sort of bottom up and allow the evidence to drive your position, you're doing yourself a lot of good things. But most importantly, you're giving yourself the most intuitive and strongest arguments on the topic, since that's obviously what the literature is going to talk about. The literature is never going to really talk about the weakest arguments on the topic. They're only going to talk about the strong ones. When you Google a topic, the first couple of results that you read are generally the most popular, and they're most popular for a reason. That's because that's what everyone thinks when they think about a topic. So that's how you should approach cases, bottom up. The next part is about thinking ahead versus thinking backwards. So this sort of relates to what I just talked about a little bit earlier, but can anyone sort of hazard a guess as to what it means to think ahead as well as think backwards when writing an affirmative case? Yeah?
So I would think thinking backwards would be you think like what the 2AR should sound like and then work from there.
Yes. And what do you think the thinking forwards part is?
Start your AC and then think from there.
Well, yes. But what do you mean from think from there?
Basically, like, frame your, like, just your one AC case first, and then think about how you're going to frame your 1AR and your 2AR.
Well, most importantly is your 1AR. So think backwards from the 2AR. Think forwards to the 1AR. So what does this mean? Let's talk about thinking backwards. Thinking backwards means the speech that you need to win a debate is not the 1AC. It's not the 1AR. It is the 2AR. You can't win with the 1AR. You can only not lose. The 2AR is what wins you a debate. You need to think, at the end of the debate, what do I want the judge to write on the ballot? And we'll talk more about this when we get to the 2AR part. What do I want the judge to think when they vote for me as the affirmative? And in order for you to get there, you need to have an affirmative that sets you up for that. You can't have an affirmative case that concludes the right to housing is best because it saves people's lives and only have affirmative contentions about how the right to housing is best because it respects freedom. It's just not the proper building block by which you can get to your 2AR. So you need to think backwards. What is your 2AR going to say to win this debate? You need to think, what is my 1AC going to set me up to do to win this debate? Okay. And I think a lot of people think about all of these LD speeches as separate speeches, right? The 1AC, the 1AR, the 2AR, separate things. But they're really just all interconnected, one giant AF speech. And they do different functions, right? The 1AR, basically is just there to not lose. The 1AC is to set up the debate. But the 2AR is really the only important affirmative speech. It's the one that wins you the debate at the end of the day. And you need to have a solid foundation from which to build on. So let's think about this topic, this human enhancement topic. What do you think in a traditional debate is going to be the strongest argument based on the fact that you've done about 2 weeks worth of research now on this topic? What is to you the best affirmative argument? Yeah.
Class inequality?
Yes, so I think the inequality argument is probably the most intuitive and easily defensible argument on this topic, especially given how prevalent it is when you immediately search human enhancement technology plus immoral. The first couple of results are all about inequality. So in order to make a persuasive 2AR about inequality, you need to have the best quality evidence that you've thought about. How am I going to explain this evidence in the 2AR? How do I want this to sound when I win? So that's the thinking backwards part. Now we're talking about the thinking forward parts. Thinking forward means you have to keep a couple of things in mind. First is that the 1AR exists, right? If it was just the 1AC and the 2AR, life would be so much easier. You wouldn't have to give a ridiculously short 1AR. But you have to think ahead towards the 1AR, which means you need to make all of your arguments as easy as possible. The more complicated your arguments are, not only is it more difficult for the judge to follow, but you're doing yourself a disservice because it is very difficult in a span of 4 minutes to explain complicated arguments to the judge. If someone's only response to your first contention is no warrant, and it still takes you 45 seconds to extend it because of how complicated of a contention it is, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're doing it wrong. The 1AR needs to be built for short, easy to understand arguments. You should be able to extend it, and the judge should immediately go, yeah, I got it, right? It doesn't take any work to extend an advantage or a contention about inequality in lay debate, right? It shouldn't take any work to say, like, extend my Aziz 14 piece of evidence, which says that it would create a biological inequality as the rich are able to afford more enhancements the poor are unable to afford, which would grant them unfair advantages in life and exacerbate existing inequality. That's 5 seconds. That's maybe 10 seconds if I was talking a little bit slower. But if you were just like some weird convoluted argument about, I don't know, super soldiers and their relation to United States hegemony, that would take like 45 seconds to explain in a traditional debate if you wanted to explain it well. That's just not possible in a 1AR. So you need to think ahead. So make it short, simple, easy to remember. Number 2, about thinking ahead, is you need to have multiple independent ways to win, right? Or multiple independent outs in the 1AR, more importantly. So a lot of my affirmative contentions, I really liked having sort of either 3 contentions. 2 of the contentions were independent reasons to affirm, and a third was a preemptive contention, or I'd have 2 independent contentions with a lot of interactions built in to answer the negatives arguments. And I'll sort of demonstrate with a layout that I threw together for the free speech topic, and we'll talk about the strategy behind that. But you want multiple outs in the 1AR. Confining yourself to just one argument means the neg only has to beat one argument. So you need at least 2 arguments in the AF that you can extend into the 1AR and think ahead. If the negative reads this NC, which argument am I going to extend in the 1AR to take out this NC? If the argument reads this turn against my case, which argument am I going to extend in the 1AR to give me an easy out to the ballot? Which is the path of least resistance for me? And the only way you can set that up is by thinking ahead and thinking forward. Finally, is you should have the most possible meaningful interaction with the most amount of possible negative arguments. Every card that you read should answer like 3 NCs, right? Or at least be 2 separate ways to win, or just be a really deep warranted way to answer to win the app. But every card that you read should be like interacting with an NC in some way, minimally, right? You should know exactly which arguments you'll extend against which negatives. If you're doing the 1AC correctly, you should not need to read a single new card in the 1AR because your 1AC set you up for you. This does not mean that you're going to read a bunch of spikes in the AF and just like hope the neg drops them. No. It means that you're going to clash on the heart of the topic. When the negative reads the most predictable negative argument on the topic, because they inevitably will, what is the AF argument that is directly built to answer it? So let's think about this topic. What is the sort of most common negative argument that you've heard? Yeah.
Bodily autonomy.
Sort of, yeah, so bodily autonomy. And the bodily autonomy stuff, like the freedom to enhance yourself as you wish, clashes very well with an inequality-based affirmative that talks about how, yes, you might have the freedom to modify yourself, but that freedom has constraints, especially in its relationship to other people. Just like no one thinks you have the freedom to kill someone, you can't also have the freedom to enhance yourself to create massive divisions between society. It's the same sort of logic of freedom that allows corporations to have mass billionaires, right? While people are starving on the streets. It's the same sort of logic that allows unrestrained wealth accumulation, that ignores the inherent equality of all people. That's an argument that directly clashes with the affirmative. It's the most predictable one that you're going to hit. And if you have an affirmative that's built directly to answer that argument, you need not read a single new argument in the 1AR, because it's all built into your affirmative case. So every given possible negative argument on any given lay topic, there's like 5, maybe 10 negative arguments. If we're being optimistic about the quality of the negative arguments that are going to be read, there are only 10 that you have to answer. And every time you write an AF, you should think ahead. How am I going to interact with these 10 arguments? Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you just need to read new answers in the 1AR. But about 9 times out of 10, you don't need to read a new answer. It already exists in your AF. Multifunctionality not only is good because it makes you look smarter, it also saves time, right? The 1AR is so much easier if you don't have to read a bunch of new arguments, and all you have to do is extend something that you already talked about. And it just makes you look so smart. Like, if your 1AR is basically just like, yeah, I knew what the negative was going to say and I'm ready for this debate, that conveys an excellent message of preparedness and intelligence that the judge is just going to be easily able to pick up on, right? When people are desperately scrambling to like put together their random answers to their NC and 1AR prep time, and it sounds like their NC answers are entirely distinct from what the thesis of the 1AC is, it just doesn't sound like a coherent, organized message, right? But thinking ahead, having those multifunctional arguments built into your AF is a really good way to convey to the judge, I've prepared, I've thought about this. Yeah, and as I mentioned, just don't riddle your AF with preempts. If your AF is just full of preempts, it doesn't make you look in control. It makes you look like you're just defensive and scared. No, preempts are not encouraged. It's instead a card that is about the topic, about your AF, but also just happens to interact with a negative case. Finally, about the meaningful interaction with the most possible negative arguments, is that you should have a vague standard. I talked about this a little bit in the other module that you were all just in for some unknown reason, but the vague standards are good because negatives are going to attempt to preclude your standard, and we'll talk more about how to do this as the negative tomorrow, but negatives are going to attempt to preclude your standard. They're going to try to read a smaller, narrower framework most of the time. They're going to read something different from yours and try to exclude all of your offense. You're going to read an AF about util, the NC is obviously going to be deontology. You're going to read an AF about respecting human rights, the NC is obviously going to be util, right? The more if you read like a more deontological version of respecting human rights, the more vague your standard is, the less likely is the NC is going to preclude. Because the most effective 1AR argument against all of those types of NCs are like, yes, those are moral harms too, but we also have to consider the affirmatives, and that gets rid of most of them. So the more vague and open your standard is to allow the negative to prevent the negative from precluding, the easier it makes you. It makes it easier for you, since you can now interact with the most possible negative arguments without having your AF just automatically mooted. There's a concern that, well, shoot, now every argument links in to the AF, which is fine, because if you already built your AF to be meaningfully interactive with all these negative arguments, they were going to read them anyways, and it's fine because you're ready for that debate. The final thing about the 1AC is the 1AC needs to establish control. The reasons negs have it easy is because their 7-minute speech wrenches away everything your 6-minute speech talked about. It restarts the debate most of the time. Most of the time, affirmatives are restarting the debate in the 1AR. They are already on the defensive, they are already on a loss. The more your 1AC establishes control for the round, establishes parameters for what it means to affirm, establishes the conditions in which it means to negate, and establishes strong affirmative arguments, it throws the negative off their balance. If you read a really good AF, a negative should think, oh shoot, all of my arguments link, but none of them matter. And they'll debate at their worst. Strong affirmative should hit the heart of the topic and immediately control the direction of the debate. Negative should be afraid to answer your affirmative because every one of their responses has already been preempted and they're going to sound silly. But the more you control the debate, the more you have an affirmative that sets you up to win the debate, it's so much harder to be negative, right? The hardest AFs to hit were just ones that were in control. They just established a good way to affirm, right? So my junior year at Nationals in quarters, I was hitting Richard Schmickler, who ended up that year having the unfortunate displeasure of losing every single final round he was in on a 2-1, including TOC, NSDA Nationals, and Minnesota State. But I got slapped by him when he was AF. Just terrible, just wrecked. Because he had an AF that was so good on the topic that I was like, shoot, he's already in control. I tried to read an NC, it kind of linked. I tried to read some turns, they kind of linked. But I knew that I'd lost the debate. That 1AC just established control so hard from the beginning of the round that there's just no way I could beat it. And that's what you need to do. All right, so before I read this AF, are there any questions about writing a 1AC and what the 1AC needs to do? All right, so we're going to read this AF that I threw together really quickly on the free speech topic. If you want to flow it, you can, but you can also just sit there and listen to it. I'll read it a little bit quicker than I normally would in a debate round because for the sake of time. We're going to quickly walk through all of the parts of it and what is strategic, if it controlled the round, and if there were strategic errors, what we could have done better. So, to suppress free speech is a double wrong. It violates the rights of the hearer as well as the speaker. Because I agree with the words of Frederick Douglass, I affirm resolved public colleges and universities ought not restrict any constitutionally protected free speech. According to the U.S. Legal Dictionary, constitutionally protected speech is the right to express any opinion without censorship protected under the First Amendment. There are limitations under the First Amendment, such as fighting words, which means that I don't defend unconstitutionally protected free speech. Since ought implies a moral obligation, I value morality because the resolution asks what public colleges ought to do. The role of public colleges and universities is to provide an environment where students are exposed to new ideas, cement personal beliefs with evidence, and prepare them to question the world and attempt to make it a better place. Therefore, the value criterion is promoting academic freedom. Prefer for 3 additional reasons. 1, while other ethical theories exist, they don't take into account the unique role that public universities have. Universities exist primarily to promote academic freedom, and even though other ethical concerns like rights are important, they don't take into account the unique obligation of a university. Second, increasing academic freedom increases the chance we come to know the truth about important issues, ranging from ethical conclusions to scientific subjects, since all perspectives are included and debated in a marketplace of ideas, which makes it a prerequisite to any negative standard. Third, a free exchange of ideas respects the intrinsic worth and autonomy of each student, since it recognizes that individuals have a right to expression by basis of their humanity. Thus, the affirmative thesis is that censorship on public colleges fails to protect rights and endangers the mission of academic freedom. Contention 1, censorship hurts academic freedom, A subpoint. Speech restrictions would discourage debate and limit academic freedom by preventing the progression of ideas. Cliff Mahoney writes, debate is a discussion between people in which they express different opinions. Since open discourse was historically encouraged on our college campuses, they pushed society's limits by admitting women and people of color and by encouraging diversity of thought. Recently on campuses, our open discourse has been threatened, and campuses are home to speech restrictions. Instead of actually debating ideas that span topics from the conventional to the taboo, a generation of American students don't engage. Many students believe that they have a right to literally shut other people up. This is not only a threat to the First Amendment, but also to American democracy. In their manifestations, free spaces, safe spaces, and free speech zones at public universities enable prejudice against unfavorable ideology. Supposedly progressive speech codes prevent the progression of ideas. Restrictive campus speech codes are, in fact, regressive. By silencing our students and young people, we started down a slippery slope. It is up to us to fight back to ensure our First Amendment rights remain protected. Subpoint B. Censoring speech gives power to the institution to determine which speech is or is not acceptable, which is problematic. Ben Weisner writes, proponents are confident the government will use authority in a manner the proponents intended. They are almost certainly wrong. Censors have sought to prohibit speech hostile to LGBTQ and speech supportive of gay rights. The only thing predictable about giving the government the power to censor speech is that it will be used that power unpredictably. Empowering the government to suppress speech is dangerous. This is especially problematic since prohibitions have no criteria and will be used by the elite for their own purposes. David Rosenberg writes, speech prohibition is no criteria for distinguishing valuable speech. Criteria will most likely become an expression of the political goals of the group that control. Efforts to suppress reflect the political power by universities controlled by an elite. Subpoint C. Speech codes encourage reverse enforcement. They're not used against actual racists, but used to shut down minority voices. To counter Friedendorf's rights. Flyers at the University of Michigan declared open season on black people. Administrators decided to implement a speech code. The racist incidents kept occurring at the same rate. White students had charged black students with offensive speech. In 20 cases, one resulted in the punishment of a black student for using the term white trash. Speech codes don't serve persecuted groups. Thus, censorship stifles academic freedom and actually results in more racism. I'm not going to read the second contention, but the subpoints there were just about counter speech and about free speech being valuable and things like that, which shouldn't be that hard to figure out what those are about. So let's talk about this affirmative case and sort of the things that I talked about being affirmative. So this case was constructed bottom up in the sense that I looked through the literature to determine what I thought the best arguments were. I also cheated and I just stole a bunch of cards from people that I judged because I needed to throw together a lay case in 1 hour. So, whatever, take that as you will. Let's talk about the thinking ahead, thinking backwards part. What do you think this 2AR had in mind when I was writing this AF?
It seems like even within one contention, you have multiple things you can go for.
Mm-hmm.
You can go for minority oppression, you can go for regression of speech, and you can go for like the obligation of college campuses to promote educational space.
Yeah, so there were already multiple independent ways to win, and all of those supported a coherent thesis and a very simple to understand advocacy, as we talked about in the statement at the beginning, right? So all of those already supports the idea of a simple thesis with multiple independent ways to win. Any one of those could have been a 2AR, a winning 2AR. I could have sat on that for 2.5 minutes and won. Yeah?
Oh, what was the thesis again?
That public colleges, that censorship on public colleges fails to protect rights and endangers the mission of academic freedom.
Okay.
So notice I've already set control in this debate, right? Instead of making this debate about free speech good, I've shifted the burden to the negative to prove that censorship was good, which already was something that most affirmatives kind of knew about but weren't explicitly doing. Now, instead of the negative just being like, free speech is bad or hate speech is bad, they need to win and say that censorship is good, which is a much more difficult position to win, both from an evidence-based perspective, but also from a rhetorical standpoint, because now every time I speak, I'm just going to call the negative censorship, and that already casts a strong moral aversion to voting negative, because they're just like, censorship kind of sucks. So that sort of is a control stuff. I've already set the standard for the debate. I've already controlled it. The negative is going to have a much harder time debating this. They're going to read their general hate speech stuff. All of it's going to be hate speech bad. None of it is going to be censorship good. And already the control is set with the affirmative. The thinking ahead stuff, well, this preempts every possible basic negative argument. Every argument for why hate speech restrictions are good, that's the entire affirmative contention, which is all designed to answer, right? Every single argument about reverse enforcement, about ceding too much power to the state, about speech codes being very difficult to determine which is effective and not, all of that is designed to directly answer the neg. These aren't preempts. They're just affirmative arguments that happen to very meaningfully interact with the most common negative arguments on the topic. I think affirmatives like this are incredibly strategic because they might be the most most basic, most predictable apps on the topic, and yet some of the most difficult to answer, right? How many of you had excellent censorship good blocks on this topic, if you debated this topic at all? I guess the answer is pretty few of you, because I've judged even top-end debaters who just didn't have enough prep and knowledge about this topic to really engage in the most core part of the debate. And I was ready for that, or my students were. I didn't debate this, right? And it meaningfully interacted with just like all the common negative arguments, right? All of the censorship stuff. So those are the types of affirmatives that I think are very strategic. All right, let's talk about the 1AR. Well, if you built your 1AC right, the 1AR is easy, right? Your only real job is just to carry the 1AC through to the 2AR, right? It's not a speech independent of the 1AC. It's just a speech that is extending most of the AF. And most of the AF already answered most of the neg, right? If the negative was going to go for, obviously, the hate speech NC in this debate, the 1AR doesn't have to read a single new card. The 1AR doesn't have to answer a single new argument. The 1AR just needs to extend everything in the AF and interact it meaningfully with the negative, right? All I need to do is extend an AF. And this 1AR becomes so much easier. When you think of the 1AR as not an independent speech that has to cover 7 minutes of speech time, but instead think of the 1AR as just an extension of an already 6-minute long speech that answered everything the negative said, it's so much easier. It is so much easier, right? So the one caveat I give to this is that the 1AC should not, again, do all of the 1AR's work. Again, it should not be all spike space. It shouldn't all be preempts to the AF, or to the neg. But it does mean that 75% of your work should have been done for you. So the 1AR, I think, generally starts from a defensive mindset, right? How do I cover everything in this debate? How do I get through 7 minutes of arguments? How do I not lose this debate? And that's part of the mindset, right? You do kind of want to be a little bit defensive because you need to think to yourself, how do I not lose this debate? But also, you need to think, well, most negatives expect this 1AR to be defensive. They expect this 1AR to be just desperately scrambling to cover things because those were the easiest 1ARs to beat. They just generally undercover something. They just generally made the debate really easy for the negative. But if you switch your mindset, and instead of being, how do I cover everything, to how do I turn every negative argument into a liability for them, generate offense, and take no prisoners, the 1AR is so much better. I think the best 1AR I gave was semis of nationals, when the negative just read a bunch of different contentions, and I was like, I think I can turn every single one of these. So I just did. And then the 2NR, instead of the 2NR being in control, because they were just like, I'm going to extend a bunch of dropped arguments, now the 2NR was like, oh shoot, I need to extend everything I wanted to extend, plus answer every single turn that was made. There were like 4 of them in that 1AR. And that 2NR was just awful in semis of nationals, because all the 1AR did was flip the script on them. Instead of the 1AR being the defensive speech, the 1AR was the one in control, because I'd always been in control from the start. The 1AC had set the groundwork for the debate and had never let it go. The 1AC was merely a reaction to a good AF, and so it left itself open to left itself open to the 1AR exploiting it. And the 1AR was like, how do I make every negative argument about the Constitution, about national security, about the social contract? How do I make it into a liability for the negative? And just turned all of them. Now I had 4 separate outs, or no, 5 separate outs for the 2AR, because I had 4 of the turns as well as the affirmative case, and although one of the turns was the affirmative case, so so 5 separate outs. That means that the 2NR, in order to have a chance of winning this debate, you need to spend 1 minute on each of those 5 separate outs, and then 1 minute on its own voting issues, which is obviously a losing speech. They just could not win that debate, because they, from the beginning, never had a chance if the 1AR was done correctly. So, don't think of the 1AR defensively. You should be prepared to generate offense. You should prep to turn most NCs on the topic. You should prep to turn every single negative argument into a liability for themselves. The 1AR being offensive, and not in the sense that you offend as many people as possible, but in the sense that you generate reasons to vote for you, changes the game. It flips the script on what it means to be negative. The 1AR also generally suffers from strategy issues in traditional debate. It generally suffers from trying to just desperately cover arguments. It suffers from issues of not figuring out what arguments to go for. So before the 1AR starts, instead of desperately trying to scribble as many arguments in your flow as possible, that shouldn't be an issue anymore because you've already got the AF thought out in your head and you've already pre-written all of the extensions for your AF and how they interact with the negative. You need to ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish? What am I going to extend? How am I going to extend what I want? And how is this going to give me a winning 2AR? Right? Instead of thinking, I gotta survive, you gotta think, how do I set up the winning 2AR here? You need a strategy. You need to think, look, they undercovered my contention about the government controlling speech. Why does this turn the NC? Why does this mean that the NC now is a reason to vote affirmative? I don't know, but maybe you'll find a way because you thought about it, right? And instead of just being like, I'm just going to extend this argument, you got to think, when I extend this argument, is this another potential reason to vote AF in the 2AR? Is this another liability for the negative? Is this another thing that they have to care about and waste their time answering? You need to think about these issues before you give a 1AR, because 1ARs that just try to cover everything don't sound persuasive. They don't have winning 2ARs built into them. It makes the job so easy for the negative because they just need to cover a few issues and you're done. But when you have a strategy, when you think about what this 1AR needs to accomplish, when you think about how to get to the 2AR, the 1AR is so much easier. The multifunctionality stuff also applies. So not only should the 1AC have been multifunctional, but most of your 1AR arguments should be multifunctional. Every given argument you make against an NC should generally have more than one function. Well, not all of them. Some of your defensive arguments just are only defensive. But one turn against one contention should also be able to turn another negative contention, for instance. And the more multifunctional you are, the better, because that allows you, instead of making separate arguments that are unwarranted, you can make one strong argument with a bunch of warrants, and then make that interact with everything else. So 3 strong arguments with deep warranting for all of them that multifunctionally interact with a negative case is better than 6 unwarranted arguments. Even though the 6 would give you more outs in the 2AR, those are less plausible outs given how unwarranted those are. So yeah, having multiple independent ways to win is good. So you need to generally extend a few from the AF and turn the neg. All right. The other thing about 1ARs is that no matter how much I tell you about them, there's no way to get better at them without just doing a bunch of drills. So before nationals, I did, as you all heard in the previous module, about 50 to 100 1ARs. For nationals, I just locked myself in my room for an hour or 2 a day, just prepped out my own AF, gave a bunch of 1ARs. I think the best drills to do are just hell 1ARs, where you get someone to write like a 10-minute NC to your AF, and you get like 3.5 minutes to extend it, and then 3, or like 3:15 and then 3 minutes. So you have 3 minutes to answer 10 minutes, and once you can do that, there is not a single difficult NC in any given traditional debate. At the point that I could do that, I was literally not afraid of anyone. I was like, look, I've known my AF for months. I've written the best possible prep out to it because I line by line every single card, and I could still beat it. So I'm fine. So yeah, you have to do that. No matter what I tell you, there's no substitute for just drilling with the 1AR. In fact, it is the only speech I ever drilled with my senior year because everything else was easy. Being neg is easy. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Being AF is a little bit harder, so that you have to prep for the 1AR. Are there any questions about the 1AR? Anything you're interested in knowing? All right, finally is the 2AR. Most important speech in the debate. As we talked about yesterday, and a little bit today, in fact, in the module, there are multiple components of persuasion. A 1AR, as we've just described it, is incredibly persuasive on a logos level. It's incredibly persuasive even a little bit on the ethos level because you sell yourself as a credible debater who's obviously really good at debate, who has prepared, who is smart, who's intelligent, hardworking, etc., etc. But at this point in time, you might be noticing that we haven't discussed the sort of more pathosy side of things and the more storytelling, crystallization side of things. And that's where the 2AR really shines. If you've done the debate correct up until this point, you're already in control of the debate. The 2NR has not been as good as the normal 2NR would have been because they're trying to recover from such a good 1AR. The 1AR didn't win you the round, but it certainly didn't lose it to you, didn't cost you the round, and more importantly, is it threw the negative off their game. You've taken control and you've never let it go. The 2NR is giving some weak voting issues. They're basically just struggling to get to everything that you said. All of your warrants are so good. You've taken advantage of the better literature that your app has to just make it much more difficult for the negative. You've had a 1AC that has just set up your arguments to be really, really persuasive, and the neg is just at a disadvantage. And if you've done it correctly, the 2NR just does not have time to get to crystallization. The 2NR just does not have the ability to even think about being an emotional, persuasive speaker. They just generally don't. And in most of these debates, that's just factually true. Most negatives do not get to that part. And even if they do, we'll talk about how to deal with that. But now you have the advantage to shift the script. Up until this point, it has been a technical debate. It has been a debate about persuasive, it's been a debate about persuasion solely on the sort of level of logic, solely on the level of debate as a game, solely on the level of debate as argument. But now, you have the ability to introduce an entirely new element of persuasion that the judge has not heard of before. You have the advantage of being persuasive from an emotional standpoint now. You get to crystallize. You get to break down a round that up until this point was incredibly messy that you get to blame on the negative. It is the negative's fault for being incredibly messy in this debate. It's their fault for not thinking about the app beforehand and coming up with a good strategy. I made this debate easy because I only went for 3 well-warranted multifunctional arguments that just did a lot for me. They went for 10 blippy arguments that made the debate hard to resolve. I'm going to be the nice person in this debate. I'm going to make this debate really easy to break down. I'm going to crystallize. I'm going to tell a ballot story. I'm going to be emotionally persuasive. I'm going to persuade you on the level of logic because it shouldn't be that hard if given that the 2AR already has been set up for you. I'm going to make this debate an entirely different form of persuasion. And this is where the last word really shines. The negative now has no game on the emotional level of appeal. The negative is no game on crystallization. The negative is no game on a ballot story. The negative is no game whatsoever. You have an entirely new set of persuasive techniques that aren't even abusive. They aren't even new, right? They're just you introducing the crystallization aspect. They're just you introducing the emotional persuasive aspect, right? They're just you being a good debater. And now it's nearly impossible not to vote AF in these instances because there's just an entirely new element of persuasion. When it's kind of close on the logic debate, the easiest way to do that is just to bypass it with the emotions debate, right? Just bypass all of that. Look, the negative might be right about these small issues. But ultimately, you have to ask yourself the question, is it okay to be free at the expense of poverty, right? Is it okay to be free when we create a system of inequality greater than the one that exists now? Is it okay to have bodily autonomy if that means that an entire generation of poor people are subjected to even worse conditions of poverty? Is it okay for any of those things to happen? And this is based on the arguments that you had. It's based on the logic. It's based on the round. You already had the arguments to control the debate. And you're already still, even in this question, being multifunctional, being interactive, being preemptive to the neg. But you're also introducing a level of emotional appeal that just didn't exist until this point in the round. And the judge is just, at the end of the debate, going to have to think, no matter whether they're a parent or a circuit judge, yeah, inequality sucks. Vote F. And it's so easy. So, that was a long rant. I'll just boil this down into a few bullet points. First is you need to take advantage of the last word by wrapping up the debate into a nice little package. You need to tell the ballot story that hasn't been told in this round. You need to identify the main points in this debate. You need to think about what this 2AR is going to, how this 2AR is going to win you the debate. How are you going to take the building blocks that you set up in your 1AC, that you extended in the 1AR, that you're now going to sell as the 30-second voting issue explanation that wins you this debate. You should think about your voting issues before the debates start anyways, right? You need, if you already have thought about your 2AR, most of your voting issues are going to be the same most of the rounds. Like the 2AR that I gave at Nationals was virtually identical almost every single time, and that extended for at least a minute and a half. The same voting issues every single time. Because I just thought about it. I was like, the neg is going to go for these arguments, and I'm just going to extend these voting issues and still win. And that's what you need to do as well. You need to properly identify the crux of the debate as quickly as you can, and you need to ensure that no matter what, the judge views the debate through your lens. Maybe the negative threw in a short little argument somewhere that the judge kind of latches onto, And that's a little bit problematic. So you need to make sure that at the end of the debate that the judge is making sure that your view of how the debate breaks down is the only coherent view, not only from the perspective of logic, but only because your view of how the debate breaks down is the only one that is consistent with their sort of emotional instincts, with their beliefs and you as a credibility as a debater, right? You need to make sure that the judge is seeing the debate from your side. And of course, all of that ties into sort of the stuff that we talked about yesterday, about being in control of the round generally, about having perceptual dominance, about being an ethos-y debater, about being a debater they want to vote for, and all that helps them view the debate through your lens. But you need to make sure that they're viewing it through your lens. And of course, you should end the last 30 seconds with the ballot story, right? You need to end with offense in the 2AR. You need to end with the sort of ballot story, because the last thing that is said in the round is generally what's sticking in the judge's minds the most. And it also helps you perceptually, because you pretend like what your opponent has said has not been relevant in this debate, that they've just never been on the same level of the debate as you. They've always just been behind you. The more that you sort of act like their arguments are sort of something to be brushed off, the more that it just seems like you're in control. Of course, you don't want to be like a douche about this, and you don't want to be like mean about this, but you definitely need to convey, look, at the end of this debate, they're just behind, right? They are just not on the same level of this debate. And that helps ensure that the judge is on the same level as you. And the more that the last 30 seconds of your ballot is like the ballot, or last 30 seconds of your speech is like the ballot, the better. The kid that I was coaching at Nationals, his last 30 seconds were generally pretty similar to every other last 30 seconds, because he would generally incorporate that emotional appeal about him being an immigrant and things like that. And that would make its way into almost every single 2AR. And you need to be able to do the exact same sort of thing. So you have a consistent message that you're really practiced at selling. Cool, so we ended about 1 minute early, but I'll stick around for until 10:55 if you have any sort of questions about affirming. Yeah.
So in a 2AR, is it just you're supporting your case and you're giving your ballot story, or do you also like...
You should respond to the issues, but if you've done this debate correctly up until this point, all of the negatives voting issues are answered by your own voting issues, right? Because remember, your affirmative case is designed to directly engage the negative. So when the negative is like, autonomy is important, your voting issue is like, is equality matters more, and then you're going to directly compare those two things, right?
So when the negative responds in their 2NR before their voting issues, should you try to cover a few of like the most important parts in your 2AR? You
might, if you think that there's a chance the judge would vote on it. I would say that most of the time, the only thing that judges look at is just the voting issue debate itself. So as long as you answer some of the voting issues for a couple of seconds at the 2AR, and then do the rest of it in sort of your summation of the round and your extension of your own voting issues, then you're fine, right? Most of the negatives voting issues in the debate are generally not even voting issues, because people don't understand the difference between offense and defense in traditional debate. But even if they are, like, those are the issues that you predicted, right? Because all of the negative voting issues have to be strong arguments. Those are the ones you predicted that they were going to go for. So your own voting issues are directly designed to preempt and interact with those. So, like, I guess in sort of a more concrete formula, the 2AR generally, in my mind, starts with a short overview about how the round breaks down. It makes it clear that we're going to talk about sort of the big picture. It answers the negative voting issues for a little bit. It extends your own voting issues, and then just goes in for the last 30 seconds on the sort of more emotional, persuasive aspect and the ballot story part, right? Of course, this changes per round. Like, the 2AR was a little bit different depending on how the negative debated, but the things that were always consistent were generally an overview about how we're going to make this round really easy for you to understand, and the last 30 seconds were almost always very similar. All right, cool. If there are no other questions, thanks for coming, and we'll